thank you very much, Chris, for the introduction. And indeed, good morning, good afternoon. And for some of my colleagues from Australia who are joining us this evening, good evening. It's a pleasure to be with you today, albeit remotely. And I must firstly apologise for my lack of Spanish, so you'll just have to put up with my English. But I would like to thank you and your team for inviting me to make this presentation today. It's a topic about which I am particularly passionate, and in particular, data to make decisions for non-communicable diseases and women in particular. To do that, maybe all of you are aware of the importance of non-communicable diseases for women, but not everyone is. And I think I use an example here. I'm showing the UN Global Strategy for Women's, Children's and Adolescents' Health. And it importantly focuses on women's sexual, reproductive and maternal health, which of course is incredibly important, but it pays very little attention to women and non-communicable disease, which is quite extraordinary in many senses, given that we know that non-communicable diseases cause about 3/4 of all death in women globally. And of those deaths from non-communicable diseases, as you would see, a very large proportion of those deaths are amongst women, are as a result of cardiovascular disease. Indeed, if we look at some of the data from the Global Burden of Disease study published by the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, we see that in the UK, of the 10 leading causes of death for women, 9 out of 10 of those deaths are the result of non-communicable diseases. If we look at Mexico also, that is exactly the same. Non-communicable diseases now account for 9 out of the 10 leading causes of death for women in Mexico. So non-communicable diseases are really important.
Okay.
So what does this mean in terms of what data do we have on non-communicable diseases by gender? What data do we have on non-communicable diseases, especially for women? But before I look at some of that data, I thought it's really important to discuss some of the definitions that I would use and others would use. When we're interested in considering women in NCDs, we're interested in understanding both sex and gender. And by sex, we mean the biological and physiological characteristics that define individuals as either females, males, or intersex persons. When we're talking about gender, we're talking about the socially constructed roles, behaviours, activities and attributes a given society considers appropriate for men and women. So when we start to look at sex disaggregated analyses of data, that enables us to identify the biological differences between females and males. When we're considering gender disaggregated analyses, that enables us to identify disparities between men and women, as well as gender fluid and non-binary persons potentially, that relate to the impact of socio-cultural and economic factors. In reality, we're interested in understanding both the biological factors and the gender factors that impact on the incidence and outcome of disease. In practice, what we find is most of the data that we would have would be self-identified gender rather than sex, but people use these terms interchangeably, and as you'll see in my presentation, I will also, albeit we do understand there are differences between the two. So what data do we have? Well, historically, if we look at cell-based research, we see in much of the published research that sex has not been specified. If we look at animal-based research, we see that a large proportion of the animals used in such research are male. If we look at human research, and in particular human trials, we see a greater proportion of women involved, but still not in proportion to the numbers of women in the population, and often not in proportion to the disease burden. If we want to then look at, well, what do we know? Oops, I moved a bit too fast there. If we want to then understand, well, what do we know about women and NCDs and the data that are available, I want to share with you a recent publication from some of our team at the George Institute, which showed that in analysing women's health journals and general medical journals, it is still the case that women's health publishing remains largely focused on reproductive health topics rather than the diseases that kill or disable women. What we saw in this analysis that was undertaken in the women's health journals, reproductive health topics increased to 49% in 2020, and in general medical journals to 47% of the articles. Indeed, articles on cardiovascular disease, the leading cause of death for women, comprised only 15.5% of the articles in women's health journals and 7.5% in general medical journals. But let's move on to the underrepresentation of women in medical research and trials and in NCDs specifically. I showed you before that women have historically been underrepresented in medical research, and that is true for NCDs. And again, some recent work from our team at the George Institute showed that this was also true for women in trials of stroke. Whereas 48% of all strokes occur in women, only 37% of trial participants are women. And in a previous report by the same authors on the same data, only 36% of trials reported analyses by sex, of which only 33% were pre-specified analyses. So, well, does it matter? Do we need to collect and analyse data by sex and gender? And if we do, how can this potentially benefit women and men? What I want to do in the next few slides is, again, provide you with some examples from the work that we've been doing at the George Institute, which really focus on better understanding differences between men and women in prevention and differences in treatment. But let me start by showing you an example that arguably might mean a lot more to many of you in the audience. I think many of you would be aware that most drugs on the market have been approved from clinical trials conducted only or predominantly in men. And even when women are included, data are seldom disaggregated and reported by sex. So it's perhaps not surprising then that women experience adverse drug reactions nearly twice as often as men. Sex differences in pharmacokinetics strongly predict sex-specific adverse drug reactions for women, but not men, which is not explained by body weight. So most current medication practices risk over-medication of women, leading to greater risks of adverse drug reactions. But let me now turn to some of the work that we've been doing, focusing specifically on NCDs, and in this instance, an example from some work that we have done in stroke, using data from the UK Biobank. That work showed that even though the incidence of stroke is higher in men, some risk factors are more strongly associated with stroke risk in women than they are in men. In particular, smoking, hypertension, and low socioeconomic status. An earlier piece of work, also undertaken by our team, focused on diabetes. It used data from an analysis of many large-scale cohort studies and large-scale data sets and showed that for women with diabetes, compared with men at diabetes, they were at 44% increased risk of heart disease. Likewise, women with diabetes were at much greater risk of stroke than were men. Turning now to looking at treatment effects. Again, work from the Institute, this time using data from the US. It showed the percentages of men and women who were appropriately prescribed statins after hospital discharge following a heart attack was much less in women than in men. Now you might say, well, does this really result in any major mortality differences? Well, and I like to quote a report that the British Heart Foundation produced a couple of years ago, which really focused on a range of research that has looked at the gender gap in heart disease. And in particular, they quoted a piece of research that they had funded, which suggested that between 2002 and 2013, over 8,000 women were likely to have died because they did not receive the same standard of care as men, even though they were both been using guidelines. So this has really important implications for health outcomes in women. I'd lastly like to present one last piece of research, this time done with our colleagues in China. And this time, it actually shows disadvantage for men. So doing this sort of research not only is beneficial for women, but potentially beneficial for men. In this study, a systematic review of 57 studies, in both men and women, awareness, treatment, and control of hypertension was low, but it was much lower in men than it was for women. So what does all of this work mean? Where do we go to next? We're starting to get data on NCDs for women. We're starting to see quite clearly that there are significant differences in awareness, in diagnosis, in presentation, and in management of non-communicable diseases for men and women. But where do we go from here? And I'd perhaps like to draw your attention on the right to a recent journal, a whole journal issue of circulation research that focused particularly on women and cardiovascular health. And the editorial accompanying it made some really important comments, which are relevant not just for cardiovascular health in women, but also non-communicable diseases and women's health generally. That article talked about we need to go the next steps from describing the problem to identifying differences to really a need for a greater understanding of both the biological mechanisms that account for sex differences in NCDs and the gender-specific factors that play a role in equitable outcomes. But perhaps most importantly, we do need to go from describing the problems, understanding why those differences occur, to developing effective sex and gender-specific interventional approaches to both reducing risks of disease and managing disease. We need to be identifying better treatments and better ways of access to care for both men and women. But I come back to the original premise of this presentation, the need for data to make decisions. And one of the ways that we are going to be able to make better decisions about women and NCDs is by the development and implementation of policies by funders, by medical journals and other relevant bodies, requiring the integration of sex and gender analyses in research. The Canadians, the US National Institutes of Health, and most recently now the EU have such policies. And the Canadians have shown, after 10 years of introducing these policies, that the policies make a difference, that research reporting the integration of sex into research has risen by 83% and gender to 33%. But not all constituents have these policies. And frankly, my colleagues in Australia, we don't have it. My colleagues in the UK, we don't have these policies. So I'm very pleased that we've recently received philanthropic funding in Australia and funding from the Wellcome Trust in the UK to now look at co-creating policies with funders of medical research to ensure that in the future, the data that we have from medical research is disaggregated by sex and gender and provides us with the information that we're going to need if we're going to improve health outcomes for women and for men. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to speak to you today.